Okay, so like Serena said, my name is Josh Andrews. I work for the BC Ministry of Agriculture, Food, and Fisheries as a nutrient management agrologist. Really what that means is I deal a lot with manure and fertilizer and soils, and then any other sort of nutrient source you'd want to put on there. And today I'm talking about soil quality and nutrients and how nutrients affect soil quality. So to give you just a brief outline, I'll do a quick background on what is soil quality, and then we'll jump into macronutrients, mostly fertilizers and manures and their effect on soil quality. Also talk about lime, micronutrients, and then ag byproducts or other soil amendments. But mostly this will be pulp and paper residuals, and then wood ash. So that's two different materials I've been specifically asked to cover just because they're two things that are becoming more available here in BC. So, I put soil quality as part of the title. So one of the first things you may wonder is, what is soil health or what is soil quality? Who gets to define it and how do we even measure it? So in the past, there was a definition for soil quality. In the 70s, it was the ability of soils to yield corn, soybeans, and wheat under conditions of high-level management. The choice of these crops to reflect soil quality in Illinois is due to their overwhelming agricultural economic dominance. So seeing as how this is a forage seminar, and we're not in Illinois, and we're not growing corn, soybeans, or wheat, I guess by this definition, no one has any soil quality. So of course, that definition didn't last very long because we grow other crops. So a more current definition for soil quality is the capacity of soil to function within ecosystem and land use boundaries to sustain biological productivity, maintain environmental quality, and promote plant and animal health. And I like this definition a lot better, mostly because it's, ecosystem or land use specific. So we're not comparing a forage field to a soybean field. We're not comparing our field to our neighbor's field. We're just comparing our field to basically what it was in the past. And how well can it be productive? How well can it maintain quality? And how well can it, promote animal or plant health? So it kind of incorporates all of those three things. So it's not just about productivity. And so I will say, we throw the word regenerative agriculture out there a lot. So building soil quality and regenerative agriculture, these things are linked because these regenerative agricultural practices like no-till or adding organic matter, things like that, these are things that we know improve soil quality. And it's, soil quality and regenerative agriculture have the same core concepts: sustain biological productivity, maintain environmental quality, and promote plant and animal health. And so I'm sure at this point, a lot of you may be thinking, wow, that's really nice that we have a definition of that, but how can I tell if I personally have good soil quality? There is no one-size-fits-all soil quality measurement. There's no probe I can stick in the ground that says, 100% good soil quality. Instead, we kind of pick out indicators of soil quality. So this would be things like soil organic matter, soil bulk density, nutrient status, pH, water holding capacity, plant available water, et cetera, et cetera. There are dozens upon dozens of things we could really measure to indicate, a soil with high quality. And the reason I bolded soil organic matter here is just because it has so many different benefits. Physically, it can enhance aggregate stability. So when you have stable aggregates in the soil, you have good water infiltration, you have good aeration. Typically, you have good water holding capacity. Soil organic matter also has chemical benefits. So obviously, organic matter has a very high cation exchange capacity, which is the soil's ability to hang on to nutrients and supply it to the plants. And so things like calcium, magnesium, and potassium are held strongly by the soil, by organic matter. There are also biological benefits. It increases soil microbial biodiversity as well as activity. And so really soil organic matter I would say, is an indicator of indicators. A lot of studies use it as an indicator of soil quality. And also, when you increase soil organic matter, usually that increases the nutrient holding capacity of the soil. It increases the water holding capacity. The bulk density goes down, aggregation goes up, and the pH buffering capacity is increased as well. And usually all of these things together mean an increased plant growth and yield, which is really what we're all looking for here, right? So I think in a lot of my slides, when I talk about soil organic matter being added to the soil, well, really this is just an indicator of soil quality. And really, as you build soil organic matter, it kind of is a vicious cycle of improving soil quality. So, let's say I add nutrients to the soil, or I make nutrients more available in the soil. Well, that will improve your plant productivity, because we obviously know plants that receive nutrients, if it's not sufficient in the soil, that will increase their growth and their yield. And by increasing that growth, there are more organic inputs. So there's more turnover of the roots. And then there is above ground tissue that, falls off the plant and decomposes. And so that adds organic matter to the soil, and that improves soil quality. And so improved soil quality, then growth goes up some more. So it is kind of I guess I would say, a vicious cycle of improvement. So compared to other cropping systems, perennial forages normally have improved soil quality. In some of the indicators, there are better aggregation, more soil carbon, a lower bulk density. I could go on and on and on about this. But the reason for this is because a forage is typically a perennial cover. So there's less disruption, there's less erosion. You're actually able to build that organic matter in the soil. There's also more root turnover because, grasses have very fibrous roots. They're constantly putting out new roots. Roots are constantly dying. So it's constantly adding organic matter to the soil, and it's not being eroded away. So it's easier to build up compared to a system that, if you have an annual crop and then you till it and then you plant another crop, you may lose organic matter that way. Talking of indicators of soil quality, the important thing is to use the indicators that are available to you. You don't have to go out and take samples and send them off to the lab and say, tell me how much organic matter I have, or tell me the buffering capacity of the soil, or anything like that. You can look at the easy ones if you want to. Really, you just want to see improvement, or you want them to stay the same, so know your soil is maintaining its quality. And like our definition of soil quality, it is land use specific. So don't be comparing your field with your neighbor's field, because there's different things going on there. Soil quality that you're measuring is specific to your soil, your crop, and your management. And so at this point, you're probably wanting me to get on with it and asking, what does this even have to do with nutrient management? Well, I'm here to tell you that nutrient additions do definitely affect soil quality. Because anytime you add something to your soil, you're adding nutrients. It doesn't really matter the source. If you add a fertilizer, that's normally a source of macronutrients. If you add micronutrients as a fertilizer, you could add a source of carbon. So that could be, some sort of wood waste, or it could be an agricultural byproduct. It could be residues from a crop, or it could be some other processing waste. But anytime you add one of these things, you're adding normally some sort of nutrient. And so without further ado, I want to talk about the effect of fertilizers and manures on soil quality. And so a lot of these slides are from a long-term project called the ASCOV long-term experiment on animal manure and mineral fertilizers. And so it's been going on since 1894. So over 125 years now. And so what's going on in this project is they are directly comparing corresponding rates of NP and K in animal manure versus mineral fertilizers. So they are adding pretty much the exact same rates of NP and K from two different sources, and that allows them to directly compare fertilizer to animal manure. And this is where a lot of what we know about nutrient management's effect on soil quality comes from. And so, Serena, I have a poll question for you, just to get you guys back engaged. If we have a field with a grass clover mixture, do you think the crop will have a greater yield if it is fertilized or unfertilized?
Got about 85% of people responding. It's pretty good.
It's good enough. Okay, so it looks like, about 75% of us said yes, adding fertilizer is good. So this is an image from the long-term experiment starting in 1950. We have, an area that it says unmanured, but that also means unfertilized. And then we have 3 other areas that received NP and K fertilizer. And so it seems to me pretty obvious, if we're looking from 1950 onwards, we're looking at forage yield here, that the field, the areas receiving fertilizer typically had a greater yield than the ones that were receiving nothing, right? And so the same thing is true about manure. So again, we're looking at yield starting at around 1950. These colored boxes or these colored icons, typically much higher than the unmanured plots here. So, as you know, adding nutrients helps crops grow normally. Plants obviously need these macronutrients to achieve what we would call optimal growth or overcome any deficiencies in the soil. And at the end of the day, the plant does not care what the source of the nutrients are. A potassium ion from fertilizer is the same as a potassium ion from manure. It's the same as a potassium ion from compost. So at the end of the day, the plant takes it up and it really can't tell the source. All right, and so now we'll go to question 2. So if a question is, will a field have more soil carbon, which we're using as an indicator for soil organic matter here, if it receives manure or no supplemental nutrients? I think we're good there, Serena.
Okay.
Okay, so most of you thought manure, and so the answer is yes, manure. So this time we're going back to almost 1920. We're looking at soil carbon, the percent over time, and as you can see, receiving either a regular rate of animal manure or a 1.5 rate, so basically more than the crop actually needs. Both of these are above the unmanured area of the field. So we know that adding manure does actually increase soil organic matter. And here's the hard question. Will a field have more soil carbon, again, using it as an indicator for soil organic matter, if it receives fertilizer or no supplemental nutrients?
Okay, we got 81%, so maybe we'll share it there.
Okay, so this one was a little bit more controversial. It's almost an even 50-50 split. But the answer is the soil will have more carbon in it if you actually put out chemical fertilizer. So a similar graph to the last one we saw, going back to 1920, we're measuring the percent soil carbon. The fields or the parts of the field that received a regular rate of NPK or a 1.5 times rate, again, still normally had more soil carbon than the parts of the field that received no additional fertilizer or manure. So since we had a split decision here, you might be wondering, how does this actually work? Well, we're adding macronutrients. Like I said, the plant doesn't care where they come from, and that leads to greater plant growth. And a lot of that extra growth, a lot of times it's left over as residue, and that becomes organic matter. And even if you're not leaving a lot on the surface, if you add nutrients, you get more stimulated root growth, and that also leaves residue in the ground. All right, so moving on, talking about just nitrogen. If you apply just nitrogen to your fields, it also has an effect on soil quality. Of course, the big thing we talk about is how ammonium-based fertilizers will bring the pH of your soil down through soil acidification. However, one of the effects of just nitrogen is actually nitrogen stimulates shoot growth in plants compared to root growth. And you'll actually end up with less soil organic matter than if just NP and K is applied. So another graph from the Askov long-term experiment, we're looking at soil carbon concentration here, and then these are different treatments. And so this is actually through the life of the experiment up till 2011. So still over 100 years worth of data. Here's the field that received, no nutrients, so that's no manure and no fertilizer. Here's the field that received a regular rate of NP and K, and so it has actually the most soil carbon. Whereas the fields or the areas of the field that received just nitrogen, well, it's a little bit lower. It's still higher than the parts of the field that received no supplemental nutrients, but still not quite as high as the one that received a regular rate of NP and K. So a good nutrient management program and maintaining soil fertility, for all nutrients generally is what's going to lead to the most amount of soil organic matter. Again, only applying nitrogen to the soil, you will have fewer nitrogen fixing bacteria because available nitrogen in the soil will stunt their growth. And also there will be changes in grass species composition. So if there are grasses with a higher nitrogen requirement, if you have a mix, well, they won't be limited as much anymore. So there will be more of those on the field. When nitrogen is low, the grasses that are better at scavenging or don't have as high of a nitrogen requirement, they'll actually be the dominant species in the field. So along with fertilizer manures, the effect on soil quality does have an interesting timeline. So normally when you make a change in your nutrient management program, these soil quality indicators will change fairly rapidly. And rapidly is a relative term. Most of the change will happen in the first, 3 to 5 years. But after a while, if you continue with the same program, it will plateau. So looking at this image here, we're looking at time versus the amount of soil organic carbon. And so, the program starts here, and then, in about 10 years, it kind of reaches its peak, and then it plateaus over time. So if you were to apply the same, nutrients year after year after year, you'll probably reach a state of equilibrium where your soil quality isn't improving, but it's also not declining either. So it could be a way of maintaining soil quality or viewing it as a maintenance program more than anything. However, I will say there is some evidence that manure, when applied at an equivalent NP and K rate as fertilizer, will actually improve soil quality more. So of course, both manure and plant growth, or excuse me, manure and fertilizer will stimulate plant growth and, generate residue that becomes soil organic matter. But there's also additional organic matter in manure that you're directly applying to the soil. So it also is able to retain nutrients to some degree and retain moisture and help with soil aggregation. So it sometimes may have a more beneficial effect on soil quality than just fertilizer. However, over applying manure can decrease soil quality. There is a lot of ions, particularly sodium and potassium in manure. And if it's over applied, it can reduce soil structure. So you end up with things like soil crusting, a little bit more erosion, and sometimes reduced percolation. So I didn't want to bore you all for an hour straight, so I actually want to stop right now and let you ask a few questions before I move on.
Thanks, Josh. We did have a question, I think, from the last slide, or last graph, a couple slides back, where it looked like you were getting a similar result for the 1.5 NPK. And is that true?
This slide?
I believe that's when the question came up. Yeah. So if you looked at the NPK, yep, that's confirmed. So if you look at the NPK next to the 1.5 NPK, it looks similar results.
Yes. Is there a specific question with that? Oh, so yeah, you do get similar results. And really all this is showing is, you know, the amount of nutrients that the crop needs has been met. So any additional, we use what we call the sufficiency level, and the sufficiency level is by definition, if we add more nutrients, the plant's not going to grow anymore. And so really what's probably happening here is, there's nothing else to stimulate plant growth. And so the same amount of residue is being created, really the same effect in the soil, the same amount of root growth. I'm actually surprised that it's even with it. I'm surprised it's not a little bit lower, just because if you do over apply some nutrients, it actually reduces yield. And that may just be the salt effect from adding too much fertilizer, but yeah, I am actually surprised they're even. All right, so let's move on to part 2. Okay, next thing is lime. So lime is, typically used to raise soil pH. Depending on the type of lime you use, it may also add magnesium. And the real reason this is important is because the pH is important for nutrient availability. If you've ever seen one of my presentations, I've probably included this pH scale on it. But really what it's showing is at what pH are these nutrients the most available. And generally a lot of the micronutrients do better at lower pHs. And then some of the other nutrients like phosphorus have a much more limited range. So the kind of compromise area that we recommend is around 6 to 6.5 for the most nutrients to be, the most available. Not to say your crops won't grow outside of this range. All crops have their preferences, but this is more about nutrient availability than it is crop preference. You may be asking, but how does this affect soil quality? Normally you would see improvements in plant growth due to greater nutrient availability. And like I said, that plant growth leads to an increased soil organic matter content, but it also increases soil microbial activity. So most soil microbes actually prefer higher pHs. They don't like it to be too acidic. And of course, their activity contributes to soil structure. And so how does that also affect soil quality? Well, there are also some chemical reactions going on that can lead to improved soil structure as well, particularly concerning calcium ions. Not lime, I feel like I should include this. Gypsum has also been shown to improve soil structure in both saline and sodic soils. So if you're looking to add calcium to basically improve your soil structure, if it's a saline soil or a sodic soil, that's something to consider adding. Not a lot about lime, but moving on to micronutrients. When I say micronutrients, boron, copper, zinc, nickel, etc. They're called micronutrients not because they're less important, but actually because they're just needed in smaller amounts. They are just as essential for plant growth as the macronutrients. Some of the main factors affecting their availability, number one is pH, but also organic matter and soil texture. I learned in school how to detect all the different nutrient deficiencies until we got to micronutrients, and then I could not tell them apart. They all look pretty similar. General chlorosis, so the leaves turning kind of yellowish. Maybe some burnt edges on the leaf. To me, really hard to tell them apart. I would not have confidence in doing it. Unfortunately, I could not find a whole lot of data on how micronutrients affect soil quality. There has been a little bit of work in Alberta where they tried to see, just is there a correlation? Where they just collected samples from a lot of sites and said, is there any sort of trend? Some of the micronutrients weren't correlated at all, like chloride. Like I said, a lot of them were correlated with pH, which makes sense because that affects their availability. For boron, it was actually correlated with low organic matter soils. So something to think about if you live in an area where the soil is very sandy and there's not a whole lot of organic matter there. But my theory on this is kind of like lime, excuse me, or macronutrients. if it limits growth, or if it's at a deficiency level that limits growth, then it's going to limit, soil organic matter creation. And really, that's, like I said, our indicator of indicators. So if we're not able to increase soil organic matter, it's kind of hard to increase some of those other indicators as well. And this just kind of links back to, the law of the minimum. They use the barrel analogy where the lowest slat is the highest the water level can get. So if you have a micronutrient that's deficient and it limits growth, well, that's going to limit basically your soil quality as well until you can correct that deficiency. I think I might have blown through that a little quickly, but I'll leave a second for other questions, and then we'll start talking about some of our soil amendments.
And a great question here as well. How often do you recommend getting a soil test for your fields to keep track of all these nutrients?
So there are some, I hate to be the legislation guy, but there are some provisions in the AEM code that say, if you apply nitrogen or phosphorus, you need to test for those things at least once every 3 years. And if you have to do a post-harvest nitrate test. So basically a nitrate test at the end of the growing season. If it's above, around 25 parts per million, then you need to test again the next year. But really every 3 years is sufficient, as long as everything looks okay.
And a good chance just to kind of start that rotation of starting just with a couple of fields each year and just slowly moving around each of them would be, I know, is something you've recommended in the past.
Yeah, I think it's easier to stay on top of it if you have to do it every year, but maybe not go do every field.
Break those up a bit. Fantastic. I think those are all the questions. We have a comment about the need to put together a cheat sheet for producers to be able to kind of keep track of some of those soils and nutrients. So, something we'll put in our back pocket to work on.
Yeah, good idea. Okay, let's move on to pulp and paper residuals. So this is actually a product that I get asked about a fair bit. So I thought it would be a good venue to talk about it. But these residuals are a solid product, and they're basically a residual of the wood pulping process. And so it's basically wood or recyclable paper or what have you, is broken down usually through a physical process and then also a chemical process. And so there's two types of this residual. There's primary and secondary residual. So with this pulping process, the primary residual has basically a physical component where they physically separate the wood fibers, clay, lime, and ash, and then there's a mix of wastewater in there as well to help process. But the primary residual is mainly waste wood fiber as well as some lime particles, and it has a very high carbon to nitrogen ratio. And so if you've listened to any other presentations on carbon to nitrogen ratio, if it's high, that means it'll be hard for this material to break down. And it will actually need to take some nitrogen out of the soil to break down, or for the microbes to break it down. And then secondary residual, it's created by settling the solids generated during the effluent treatment process. So kind of the leftovers of the primary process. And normally nitrogen and phosphorus are added during this. Unlike the primary residuals, it has a low carbon to nitrogen ratio. So it breaks down a little bit quicker, and depending on the C to N ratio, it may add nitrogen to the soil as well. So at a lot of mills, the primary and the secondary residuals are combined, and then they're dewatered, because as you can imagine, some leftover wood pulp holds on to water pretty well. So in Quebec, where this has been studied a little bit more, usually the water content, even after dewatering, is somewhere between 45 and 75%. So still mostly water. And so the carbon to nitrogen ratio of this material, as well as the nutrient content, kind of varies, obviously depending on the type of materials used, how it's processed, any supplemental materials that are added, and then storage, handling, things like that. So really, it's kind of hard to give an exact, here's what this will look like. The answer is usually it kind of depends, which usually leads me, excuse me, rip my own headphones out. Usually leads me to say, just do a nutrient analysis on it. So this is kind of review some different materials. And if you look at the C to N ratios here, it ranges from about 86 to 1 to about 350 to 1. So our final question, do you think some of these pulp and paper mill residuals, will they add nitrogen to the soil, or do you think they'll remove it through immobilization? Okay, it looks like most of you said it will immobilize nitrogen. Normally with this kind of question, the answer is actually, it depends. But most of the time, this material will immobilize soil nitrogen. Normally, if you have a C to N ratio of 30 to 1 or more, that's in the immobilization range. There's not enough nitrogen for the microbes to break this material down. If it's 30 to 1 or less, normally that's enough nitrogen in the material. Microbes can break it down without having to take any out of the soil. So most of the materials, or at least most of the ones I've sent the analyses of, have a pretty high carbon to nitrogen ratio. And so they will immobilize soil nitrogen. If this is something you want to apply, actually, if you add supplemental nitrogen, it can help in the breakdown. Usually somewhere between 2 to 20 pounds, that's a pretty big range, per metric ton of material. But like I said, it depends. Some will have the carbon to nitrogen ratio that's low enough to add nitrogen. So always check the analysis if you're thinking about applying it to your field. But does it have an effect on soil quality? Normally, the answer is yes. But like all things, there is a lot of dependencies. Depends on the type of material, the carbon to nitrogen ratio, the nutrient content, the soil texture or other soil properties of the field it's applied to, application rate, etc. However, in some reviews, about 9 tons per acre was the magic number in Canada to increase soil carbon or increase soil organic matter. However, I'll warn you, 9 tons per acre is generally, if you apply it at once, usually enough to smother a crop, or at least a forage crop. So if you're thinking about applying this, maybe do half and half, or break it into 2 or 3 different applications. Like I said, 9 tons per acre is about the rate when soil carbon starts to increase where you're adding this. This may be a little more difficult in forage systems, mostly because we're not incorporating it into the soil. However, if you make consistent applications, usually that upper 10 centimeters or about 4 inches of the soil profile will have increased soil organic matter. Also, because it's a good source of carbon, it has been shown to stimulate soil microbial activity, which of course helps with soil aggregation and soil structure. Another thing with this material is it actually increases water holding capacity and the plant available water of receiving soils. And so what I understand is this is actually the factor that is most likely to increase crop growth, just because it does such a good job of holding water and supplying it to the plant. It may only be temporary, mainly because the material itself holds a lot of water. So as it breaks down, that water holding capacity will go down. However, long-term applications will probably increase water holding capacity because it will help to increase the soil organic matter content. So there's kind of 2 different factors going on here. There's, the material itself can hold water, but then if you add soil organic matter, it will hold water as well. And a similar thing to the improved soil physical properties, these residuals have been shown to lower the soil bulk density, increase soil aggregation, and also improve soil water infiltration. And like I said, 2 things going on here. That's because of increasing soil organic matter that improves these soil physical properties, and also the property of the residual material itself. Just because, it holds water well and it stimulates microbes, it also has kind of its own, forms its own aggregates as well, and keeps the soil kind of light and fluffy. So it improves these soil physical properties on its own. Lastly, it can be used as a liming material, because there are a lot of alkaline materials used in the pulping process. So if you have a low soil pH, normally around 5.4 or below, it normally leads to increased growth, just because raising that pH will increase nutrient availability for the crop. So I've finished up with pulp and paper residuals, if anyone has any specific questions for these.
Yeah, we had a great comment from Dr. George Powell of just a quick note of saying that pulp residual applications in BC are required to have a soil amendment plan. So just reminding producers who are interested in this that you do need to have a plan in place that is signed off by an agrologist who will be setting up your application rates as well. I think those are all the questions we have so far on the pulp and paper.
So then we'll move on to the last thing, and that's wood ash. So I probably don't have to describe wood ash. It is just the leftover material from burning wood. Normally for large quantities, they go through some sort of industrial size combustion system. Hopefully someone's not pulling a ton out of their stove at home and piling it up somewhere. Again, the nutrient content of this material depends on type of wood, temperature of combustion process, a lot of different factors. Again, get a nutrient analysis before you apply anything. However, wood ash typically has a lot of calcium in it. It's normally around 15 to 20% of the total material, but it's also a good source of potassium, phosphorus, magnesium, and then other micronutrients. So if it was a fertilizer, it would have an analysis of around 0.13. So this is a figure showing how much nutrients you'd be applying in pounds if you were to apply 5 tons of wood ash per acre. So you can see 5 tons, you end up with almost 2,000 pounds of calcium and around 400 pounds of potassium. So a pretty good source of potassium, considering a lot of crops require almost as much potassium as they require nitrogen. Much like the pulp and paper residuals, this can be used as a liming material. And in fact, it is pretty effective. It has a calcium carbonate equivalent, if you've ever heard this word, of about 50%. So basically what a calcium carbonate equivalent is, it compares the liming capacity of a material to ag lime. So really this number is saying it's about 50% as effective as agricultural limestone in raising soil pH. Like I said, an analysis is always great if you're going to apply things to your field. Serena very nicely sent me an analysis of some wood ash that UNBC was using in a study, and the calcium carbonate equivalent of that was around 48%. So can definitely change the soil pH fairly easily. Wood ash has been shown to improve soil structure. Much like lime, adding calcium to the soil helps to bind these individual soil particles together into more stable soil aggregates. So this would be particularly helpful in low organic matter soils, which organic matter normally contributes a lot to soil aggregation. Wood ash, like I showed you the NP and K analysis, it improves soil fertility, particularly in P and K deficient soils. Also, it improves fertility by making nutrients more available by raising pH. And much like chemical fertilizer, it may lead to greater soil organic matter just by increasing plant growth. And so this is actually a study that was done in Alberta. So what they were doing here is they were comparing wood ash, lime plus phosphorus fertilizer, and then lime and then lime plus phosphorus to wood ash. And so you can see the yield here. Here are different treatments. We see that adding ash gave a much higher yield than lime and phosphorus fertilizer. potentially due to having micronutrients in it or changing the pH. But depending on where you are, could have a very significant effect on the yield. And so with that, that is actually all of my presentation. Now I'll open the floor up for questions. It doesn't have to be about wood ash. It can be anything you want to ask.